She had always known that crying brought no comfort in that house, but on that particular evening, the pain was too much to keep inside. The lash of her stepmother's cane still burned across her back, each welt a reminder of how small and powerless she truly was. She had tried, as she always did, to be quiet about it, biting her lip, squeezing her eyes shut, hoping the pain would pass without witness. But her stepmother had eyes sharper than the village hawks, and ears trained to catch even the most stifled sob. The girl had barely let a single tear fall when the door creaked open. She spun around, startled, and there stood the tall, lean figure of her stepmother, framed in the flickering lamplight like a creature out of the old warnings, the kind of woman the old griots whispered about in hushed voices, the kind they said could trap thunder in a bottle or steal a child's breath with a kiss. Without a word, her stepmother stepped into the room, and in her hand was a clay jar. It was no ordinary jar, coated in dried ash and streaked with reddish ochre symbols that seemed to shift when looked at too long. The woman moved swiftly, gracefully, and with precision, catching the tears from the girl's cheeks as if harvesting dew from the leaves at dawn. Each drop made a faint hissing sound as it landed in the vessel, like steam rising from firewood after rain. The girl tried to move back, tried to cover her face, but her body would not obey. Something about the stepmother's eyes held her frozen in place, those deep, charcoal irises that shimmered with something more ancient than age. And as the last tear fell into the jar, her stepmother leaned in close, her breath carrying the scent of dried herbs and something metallic. She whispered strange, swirling words in a language the girl did not recognize but felt settle in her bones like smoke. The room grew colder, unnaturally so. The warmth from the lantern seemed to flicker and cower, retreating toward the corners. And then it happened. A subtle, silent change, but one the girl felt immediately. The heaviness in her chest, the ache that had always followed her grief, lifted. The sorrow that had coiled itself in her throat, tight and bitter, faded. She stood blinking, trying to summon the familiar wave of sadness. But it didn't come. There was only stillness now. Not peace, not calm, just a numbing emptiness, like a drum with its skin torn open. Her stepmother's smile was thin and satisfied. "Now," she said, her voice like wind slipping through cracks, "you'll be easier to raise. No more wailing. No more pitiful whimpers." She placed a hand gently on the girl's cheek, and though it looked tender, it felt like ice. "You must never cry again. If you do, there will be nothing left to steal." The girl didn't understand. Not entirely. But even if she had, what could she have done? Her sadness had been taken, ripped from her like a thread from a loom. She tried, in the days that followed, to feel. When she burned her finger on the cooking stone, when the other village children mocked her worn-out tunic, when she saw the grave of her mother hidden beneath the acacia tree, nothing stirred inside her. No tears, no tightening in the chest. Only blankness, like the silence between songs. She began to move through her life like a ghost. The tasks she once struggled with, pounding millet, fetching water, sweeping the compound, she now completed without complaint or delay. But it wasn't discipline or obedience that drove her. It was the absence of resistance. Without her sadness, she no longer dreaded punishment, feared disappointment, or longed for comfort. She simply acted. The village women began to comment. "She's so quiet," they'd say. "So obedient. Like a little statue." The stepmother would nod proudly, placing a hand on the girl's shoulder. "Grief is an indulgence," she'd reply. "Children need structure, not tears." But the girl knew something wasn't right. She watched others cry, small boys scraped from a fall, mothers weeping at funerals, even her stepmother occasionally releasing quiet sobs in the dead of night. And she envied them, not for their pain but for their ability to feel it. For the way sorrow seemed to shape their expressions, bend their bodies, cleanse them in some way. She longed to feel anything that deep again, to be overwhelmed by something real. Once, she cut her palm on a shard of broken calabash, hoping the sting would summon some echo of emotion. But nothing came. Just a dull awareness of the wound and the sight of blood beating up like red seeds. She watched the droplets fall to the earth and thought, perhaps if they were tears, her stepmother would collect them too. Then there was the jar. She began to think about it constantly. Where did her tears go after they were stolen? What power did that strange vessel hold? And what did her stepmother want with her sadness? One evening, she waited until the stepmother went to the river for washing. She crept into the older woman's room, careful not to disturb the hanging charms or the dried herbs tied above the doorway. And there, behind a woven mat, was a shelf lined with jars. Dozens of them. Each one etched with a different pattern, each sealed with cloth and wax. But she recognized hers immediately. It was the smallest, and on its base was a single fingerprint, hers from when her tears had been taken. She reached for it. The instant her fingers touched the jar, a pulse of something moved up her arm. Cold, ancient, and wild. She held the jar to her chest and listened. It was silent. But as she closed her eyes, a soft wailing seemed to drift into her mind, not loud, not angry, just sorrowful, like a lullaby sung in mourning. Her own sadness, trapped and echoing in the clay belly of this vessel. She wanted to open it, to let it spill, to flood herself with what had been taken. But fear held her hand back. The stepmother's warning echoed through her, "If you cry again, there will be nothing left to steal." What did that mean? What would happen if the jar was opened? That night, she sat by the fire, the jar hidden beneath her wrapper, and stared into the flames. Her stepmother returned, speaking of chores and village gossip, but the girl barely heard. Her heart, silent for weeks, began to stir, faint and uncertain, like embers catching air. When she looked at her stepmother now, she didn't see power or wisdom. She saw hunger. A thirst for control, for silence, for stillness in others. It made sense now, why the woman seemed so content when others obeyed without question. Why she never wept at funerals or flinched at suffering. She had likely stolen many tears, drained many souls. But why? What use was a child's sorrow? Was it fuel for some dark magic? A trade with spirits? Or was it simply to hollow others out so she could fill them with her will? The girl didn't have answers, but she had a growing resolve. She could not live like this, numb and empty, her spirit bottled and shelved like something forgotten. She would reclaim what was hers. Later that night, while the wind stirred the trees and owls called in the dark, she returned to the room. Her hands trembled as she peeled away the wax and cloth seal. The air seemed to shift around her, tightening. The second the jar opened, the room filled with a sudden gust, like a breath being exhaled after too long held. And then it came, a surge of feeling so sharp and complete it dropped her to her knees. She wept. Not in soft sobs but in deep, soul-shaking cries that racked her body and cracked open the dam inside her. The tears came hot and unending, not just from that night but from every injustice, every ache, every forgotten kindness. Her mother's absence, her father's silence, the cruelty of being unseen, everything rushed through her at once, wild and furious. The stepmother burst into the room moments later, eyes wide with horror. "What have you done?" she screamed. "You fool. You foolish girl." But the girl did not stop crying. She couldn't. And in that moment the stepmother began to shrink, not physically but in presence. The shadows no longer clung to her, her voice no longer filled the room. The girl's cries drowned out every spell, every command. With each tear the stepmother's power thinned. Her hold, built on stolen grief, was unraveling. For the first time the girl saw her for what she truly was, lonely, desperate, and terrified of emotion. When the sun rose, the jar lay empty beside her, and the stepmother sat in the corner, defeated, whispering to herself in the same strange tongue, but now it held no power. The girl rose, eyes swollen but alive, breath ragged but her own. She would cry again, yes. And she would laugh and rage and mourn. For in her tears she had found herself again. And no one would steal her sorrow, or her strength, ever again. At first, the glow was so faint she thought it was a trick of her eyes, perhaps moonlight slipping through a crack in the wall, or the last ember of a dying coal playing tricks on the shadows. But when it happened again the next night and then again after that, the girl could no longer dismiss it. There, tucked in the back corner of the room her stepmother always kept locked, was the same clay jar that had once held her tears. It sat on a shelf surrounded by dried herbs, feathers, bones, and other strange items she could not name, pulsing with a dull reddish-orange light like a heartbeat buried in ash. She had discovered the room by accident. A rat had chewed through the millet sack in the kitchen, and the girl had followed it as it scampered down the hall. To her surprise, the door that was always bolted had been left ajar. Curiosity pushed her through, and once inside, she knew this was a place not meant for her eyes. The air was thick, heavy, carrying the scent of scorched wood, sweat, and dried blood. Everything in the room felt wrong, too quiet, too still, as though the walls were listening. But it was the jar that drew her. Even from across the room she could feel it, an invisible pull, not like gravity but like emotion. It vibrated with the unspoken, the unheard. As she stepped closer, she could hear something, not quite words, not quite whispers, but the echoes of crying. It was muffled, far off, like someone weeping behind a closed door. Her own tears. Her own voice. She backed away quickly, her heart thundering. That night she could not sleep. She kept hearing it in her head, that eerie hum, that pulse like the beat of a hidden drum. The next day she watched her stepmother more carefully. The woman still moved like smoke, calm, cold, with eyes that missed nothing, but now the girl noticed other things. Whenever someone in the house spoke of sadness, the stepmother would glance toward the hallway with a flicker of recognition. When the neighbor woman spoke of her husband's illness, the girl saw the jar glow faintly beneath the floorboards. When she herself mentioned a memory of her mother, the air around the stepmother grew tense, as if fire waited beneath her skin. It became clear over time. The jar responded not just to tears but to sorrow in any form, spoken or felt. And each time the stepmother seemed to draw strength from it. Her posture grew taller. Her voice more commanding. Even the fire in the hearth burned brighter when sorrow was mentioned nearby. It wasn't coincidence. It was magic. The girl began experimenting in secret. She sat in the hallway outside the forbidden room and whispered to herself, memories of loss, of pain, of longing. And always in response came the glow. Stronger, steadier. She could feel it in her bones like heat crawling up her spine. The jar was feeding on emotion. On hers. Perhaps on others too. But the connection between her pain and the jar's power was undeniable. And the more she explored this idea, the more the pieces fell into place. Her stepmother's obsession with silence. Her rage whenever the girl cried. The warning, if you cry again there will be nothing left to steal. It hadn't been a threat about her safety. It had been about control. If the girl kept crying, the magic would be too strong to contain. Too dangerous. So the woman had sealed the sadness away, rationing it like firewood, keeping it hidden, glowing, under her command. The magic wasn't just about silence. It was about domination, over heat, over emotion, over people. Fire obeyed her. Doors creaked open for her when she passed. She never seemed to tire, and when the village women complained about their burdens, she would smirk, untouched by the fatigue that wore others down. The girl now understood. The stepmother had built her power on the suffering of others. She had trapped emotions, bound them, fed them into fire to fuel her will. And the girl, empty, hollowed out, had been her main source. But the emptiness had begun to crack. Since opening the jar and reclaiming her tears, something inside her was shifting. She felt again. Not just pain but other things, anger, curiosity, defiance. And with those feelings came questions. If sorrow could be stolen, could it also be weaponized? Could she, too, shape it into something powerful? She started keeping a small journal, scraps of old paper hidden under her sleeping mat. She wrote down every time the jar pulsed, every word that made it respond, every time her stepmother's fire roared higher. She began to whisper grief like a spell, watching the jar react. She learned that direct sorrow worked best, memories tied to people, names, places. And she learned that when enough sorrow was spoken, the stepmother would retreat into the room, sometimes locking herself in for hours. It became a game of sorts. Push and pull. The girl would whisper sadness into the air and watch how her stepmother responded. Some days it made her stronger. Other days it seemed to overwhelm her. That was when the girl realized the magic wasn't stable. It required balance. Too much sorrow too quickly and it would become chaotic, unpredictable. Like feeding too much wood into a fire and causing it to choke on its own smoke. One night, during a village gathering, the girl listened as an old griot spoke of ancient magic. Of those who bent emotion to their will, crafting spells out of pain. He spoke of jars that glowed with stolen voices, of witches who fed on grief. The elders laughed nervously, calling it myth. But the girl knew better. The stories were real. And her stepmother was one of them. That night she made a decision. She would not let her sorrow be fuel for another's fire. Not anymore. She returned to the hidden room, heart pounding, carrying with her a single candle and the scrap of red cloth her mother had left her. She placed the cloth beside the jar and sat before it cross-legged. She spoke aloud, not in whispers now but in full voice, about her mother's smile, her father's abandonment, the pain of loneliness, the coldness of this house. She poured everything into the air, watching the jar glow brighter, pulse faster. It began to shake. The light spilled across the room like a sunrise behind stone. The herbs trembled. The dried bones rattled. And then came the fire. Not from the hearth but from the jar itself. A flickering flame erupted from the mouth of the vessel, small at first, then growing taller, hungrier. But it did not burn her. It danced around her, warming but not consuming, like it recognized her voice. Her sorrow. Her truth. Her stepmother stormed in moments later, face twisted in fury. "What have you done?" she screamed. "Do you even know what you're playing with?" "Yes," the girl said calmly. "My own heart." The woman reached for the jar, but the flame recoiled, flaring between them like a barrier. The girl stood, eyes steady. You stole my sorrow to control me, to make yourself strong. But sorrow is not meant to be caged. It must flow, burn, heal. Her stepmother snarled, but she could not cross the fire. It grew brighter, surrounding the jar, surrounding the girl, until the room glowed like a furnace. You were never meant to hold it, the girl said. That power was never yours. The jar cracked. A sound like thunder rolled through the walls. Light exploded outward, not with destruction but release. The trapped emotions, the tears, the cries, the grief of years, poured out in waves. And in that flood the girl felt whole. Her stepmother collapsed to her knees, screaming, clawing at her chest as if her own strength were draining away. And maybe it was. The fire no longer answered her. The sorrow no longer served her. When it was over, the jar lay in shards. The flame gone. The room silent again, but not with emptiness. With peace. The girl walked out before dawn. The world outside smelled of earth and dew. The trees rustled gently like applause. She did not look back. She had her sorrow again. Her fire. Her voice. And they were hers to keep. It happened on a night when the sky was deepest black, the moon hidden and even the stars shying away as if the heavens themselves feared what stirred within the walls of the house. The girl had crept to the forbidden room again, silent as shadow, her breath barely stirring the air. She needed to be near the jar, not out of curiosity now, but to feel the rhythm of its glow, the way it pulsed when her emotions brushed too close to the surface. It had become a ritual of sorts, this secret communion with the vessel that had once stolen her sorrow but now mirrored her defiance. That night, however, something changed. The glow was more erratic, twitching like a firefly caught in glass. It flickered violently, then dimmed, then blazed again. The girl drew closer, heart pounding, and that was when she saw it, a bead forming at the jar's mouth. But it was not water. Not a tear. It was flame. Tiny, delicate, like the first spark struck from flint. It hovered for a breathless second, then slipped over the lip of the jar, trailing a faint curl of smoke. She moved without thinking, her hands moving faster than thought. She caught the ember in an old hollowed stone she had once found near the riverbed, a small, smooth bowl she used to hold pebbles, once a child's toy, now something sacred. The ember did not burn the stone. It curled gently inside it, glowing with quiet intensity. The girl stared, astonished. This was no ordinary fire. It had weight, presence. It felt like something alive, not alive like a creature but alive like memory. It hummed against her palm with a warmth that spread through her, not scorching but soothing, like a heartbeat pressed to hers. She slipped the stone into her apron and tiptoed back to her sleeping mat. The ember nestled there for the rest of the night, its glow faint through the fabric but steady. When she finally slept, her dreams were unlike any she had known. She did not dream of sorrow or silence or shadowy halls. She dreamt of fire that danced in her hands, of her voice ringing like bells, of running across open fields with no weight upon her shoulders. In the days that followed, she kept the ember hidden. During chores, during mealtimes, during her stepmother's cold glances and cryptic mutterings, she carried the stone close. And it began to change her, not her face or body but something deeper. Her spine straightened. Her eyes no longer darted downward. She began to feel again, but not just grief and fear. There was something more now. Resolve. A heat that hummed inside her, soft but unyielding. She would sit with the ember in quiet moments, watching its glow. It never dimmed, never flickered, as if it was waiting. It wasn't long before she noticed the world responding differently to her. The kitchen fire, usually reluctant and sputtering, sprang to life with a single breath when she stood near. The pot water boiled more quickly. A candle relit itself after a gust of wind snuffed it out. And once, when her stepmother raised her voice in the middle of a scolding, a small crack split across the wall behind her, not because the girl had shouted back, but because she had refused to lower her gaze. The ember, she began to realize, was more than a fragment of flame. It was her grief, yes, but changed, transformed, made into something solid and powerful. It was the sorrow she had been forced to bury, hardened and honed like a coal under pressure. No longer a wound but a weapon. The house itself seemed to recognize it. That same heavy air she had always felt in the forbidden room, dense and pressing, like breathing through cloth, began to lighten when she carried the ember near. The oppressive silence her stepmother wrapped around the halls began to fracture. Birds returned to the window ledges. Even the trees near the house, once sickly and leaning, now stood straighter. Still she told no one. Not the village children who sometimes eyed her warily. Not the women who whispered about her stepmother's unnatural strength. The ember was hers alone, a secret born of pain but fed by defiance. She tested it in small ways. When the village children taunted her, she did not retreat. She met their jabs with quiet eyes and watched as their courage wavered. When the baker shorted her on bread again, she held the stone under her shawl and repeated the number she was owed, calm, certain, and the man, sweating, gave her the full loaf. Power, she learned, did not always roar. Sometimes it glowed softly, steady and warm. But with power came risk. Her stepmother had begun to grow suspicious. She watched the girl more closely, her eyes narrowed, her footsteps more frequent in the halls where the jar was kept. One evening, the girl caught her kneeling by the jar, whispering furiously in a tongue she did not understand. The jar pulsed angrily, its glow jagged as if resisting her. The woman slammed her hand down on its lid and cursed. The girl slipped away before she was seen, the ember thudding in its stone as if echoing her racing heart. She knew then that the jar was weakening. The ember's escape had changed it, perhaps had wounded it. And her stepmother could feel it. Her control was fraying. The sorrow she had stolen was no longer hers to command. Part of it had returned to its source. And that part now burned. That night, the girl sat outside beneath the stars, the ember cradled in her hands. She thought of her mother, not just the pain of her loss but the laughter in her voice, the warmth of her embrace. She thought of her own voice, silenced for so long, now beginning to ring clear again. And she thought of the fire inside her, no longer caged, no longer afraid. She whispered to the ember, "You are mine. You were taken but you returned. You are pain but also strength. You are not what she made you. You are what I have become." The ember flared just once in silent agreement. In the days that followed, her stepmother's power continued to fade. Her spells faltered. Her voice lost its venom. She burned herself on the hearth one morning, shrieked, and for the first time in years the girl did not flinch. She simply watched, eyes calm, the ember warm against her chest. The time for fear had passed. One evening she stood before the jar again, not to weep, not to reclaim, but to confront. The clay was cracked now, its glow feeble like an old lantern running out of oil. Her stepmother, caught off guard, tried to block her path. But the girl raised the stone, and the ember within shone like a sunrise. "You used my sorrow to chain me," she said. "But sorrow doesn't belong in jars. It belongs in hearts. And this," she held the ember high, "is what sorrow becomes when it survives." She did not need to break the jar. It broke itself. With a sound like thunder and a burst of golden light, the jar shattered. Its fragments scattered across the floor like forgotten grief, useless and inert. Her stepmother fell to her knees, powerless, her mouth moving but no sound coming. The fire no longer listened to her. It had chosen someone else. The girl turned, ember in hand, and walked into the night. Not away from pain but through it. With every step the ember glowed brighter. She had become her own fire. The morning after the jar shattered, the girl left the house for the forest. Not in fear but in search of answers. She knew now that her stepmother's cruelty had not been random. It had always been purposeful, ritualistic, controlled. The ember she now carried had revealed part of that truth, but not all. There was still too much she didn't understand. Why her tears had power. Why the jar had pulsed with flame. Why her stepmother's voice had sounded like it came from something older than her body. The trees welcomed her as she stepped beneath their canopy. The village lay on the other side of the hill, quiet and wary as always, but she knew there was one person there who might know more. An old woman who lived in the house with the bent roof and the moss-covered steps. They called her Elder Nana, a name spoken with both reverence and fear. Children whispered that she could talk to animals. That she never aged. That she remembered things even the village stones had forgotten. When the girl arrived, the door was already open. Nana sat by a low fire, her back straight, her eyes cloudy but sharp as thorns. She didn't speak when the girl entered, just motioned for her to sit. The air smelled of herbs and soot and something else beneath it, something ancient. "You brought it, didn't you?" Nana finally said, her voice dry as old bark. The girl nodded and reached into her cloak. She held out the hollowed stone with the ember still glowing inside, quiet but alive. Nana leaned closer, eyes flickering. "It's changed. Stronger now. No longer just grief. This one's turning into purpose." The girl's fingers tightened around the stone. "I need to know what it is. Why she kept my tears. Why the jar burned." Nana sat back with a long sigh, reaching for a bowl of dried berries. She plucked one, chewed slowly and finally began. "In the old wars before even my mother's time, witches walked the lands, Not the broomstick tales your stepmother fed you, but women who understood the soul of things. Pain, joy, memory, time, they knew how to hold it all. Harness it. The girl listened, barely blinking. They created jars, Nana continued. Not like pots or cups, but vessels carved with incantations. These jars could store sorrow. The kind of sorrow that would otherwise destroy the spirit. Death of a child, the betrayal of a sister, the fall of a home. Instead of letting that pain rot the heart, they extracted it, sealed it inside, and used it to power magic. Why pain? The girl asked, her voice small. Because it's the purest fuel, Nana said, her voice reverent. Joy fades, fear crumbles, but pain burns forever if you let it. And so the witches learned to trap it. Turn it into fire. Into protection. Into power. The girl looked at the ember. That's what this is then? Nana nodded. A shard of ancient fire. And your stepmother, she wasn't just cruel. She was practicing. She was continuing a rite older than this village. But not for your benefit. The room grew colder. She knew about the wars, Nana continued. She knew that the witch's magic wasn't destroyed, only hidden. The jars, those that survived, were buried, broken, or kept by secret guardians. I suspect your stepmother was one of them, though she twisted the role into something darker. The girl remembered the way her stepmother had murmured over the jar. The way she whispered words into the clay, eyes gleaming, mouth trembling with effort. She said, I must never cry again, the girl whispered. That wasn't a warning, Nana said, it was a lock. Every tear you shed gave her more to work with. She needed your grief but not too much. Just enough to feed the jar. The girl shivered. But why me? Nana looked at her for a long time. Because you carry old blood. I see it now. The flame wouldn't have survived in your hands otherwise. Your mother's line, it runs deep. Perhaps she was one of them. A witch who chose to walk away from the wars. Your stepmother may have envied her, feared her. And when your mother died, she saw her chance. The girl swallowed hard. So I was never meant to live free? You were always meant to awaken, Nana said, voice gentler now. That ember isn't just a leftover spark, it's a beginning. What you choose to do with it now matters more than what was done to you. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind had picked up, leaves rustling like old voices. But there's more, Nana said, her gaze turning grave. This village, it sleeps on forgotten bones. Beneath its soil lie the remnants of the old wars. Spells bound in stone. Curses still humming. Your stepmother wasn't just hoarding your pain for power. She was holding something back. Guarding it. Maybe even preparing for its return. The girl felt the weight of her ember shift in her palm. Return? Nana nodded. There are whispers, echoes in the wind, that the boundary between this world and what came before is weakening. Your stepmother wasn't just collecting sorrow. She was feeding something. Or holding it in place. The girl felt dizzy. And now the jar is broken. The seal is cracked, Nana said. Which means whatever lay beneath it might stir. But not all is lost. The ember you carry is more than memory. It's a counterweight. If darkness rises again, you may be the only thing strong enough to meet it. The girl stood slowly. Her legs trembled, not from fear, but from the magnitude of what she now knew. Her life had never been small, even if it had felt that way. It had been watched, shaped, pushed toward this moment. What do I do? She asked. Go back, Nana said. Not to be her ward again. But to prepare. There may be others like her, others who remember. You'll need to learn the old ways. You'll need to find more embers. More truth. There are stories written in ash and blood and stone. And you, child, are now part of them. The girl nodded. As she stepped outside, the wind rushed through the trees, carrying the scent of earth and magic. The village lay quiet in the distance. The house she had once feared waited for her return. But she would not return as a child. She would return as a keeper of fire. As a guardian of what burned within her. The ember glowed brighter in her palm, pulsing with the rhythm of something ancient. Something awakening. She sat beneath the old tree near the edge of the forest, the ember cupped in both hands, its warmth seeping into her skin, into her bones, into something deeper she couldn't yet name. It pulsed gently, like a heartbeat not her own, a rhythm she was beginning to understand. She had carried it for days now, hidden close to her chest, but never daring to truly test its limits. Not until now. The village moved quietly behind her. Life had resumed its old pace, vendors shouting at morning markets, fires lit at dusk, children laughing, but she had changed. She no longer flinched at the sound of her stepmother's footsteps in her memory, nor at the emptiness that had once hollowed her out after every cry. The numbness was fading, replaced by something slow and dangerous, the return of feeling. It began one evening when the memory of her mother's lullaby drifted into her mind, sudden and uninvited. Her voice, soft, lilting, alive. The girl had crumpled where she stood, grief flooding her so quickly it stole her breath. But as the tears came, wetting her cheeks and falling onto the hollowed stone, something astonishing happened. The ember flared. It didn't hurt her. It didn't burn the stone. It simply surged, like it had been waiting. That night she cried again. Not out of fear or pain but in remembrance. She let herself grieve fully, curling into the forest floor beneath the stars, whispering names and regrets to the trees. The ember glowed brighter still, its flame now steady, no longer flickering like it might die. It was alive and it was listening. The next morning she returned to the clearing to begin training. At first there was nothing graceful about it. Her fingers blistered more than once, even though the ember never scorched her skin outright. She practiced holding it longer, letting the fire inch its way into her arms, her breath, her chest. The warmth was intense but the pain only came when she resisted it. When she let go, let herself feel, it flowed through her like water. She didn't know how long she trained each day. Time bent in the forest, hours folding into one another, light slanting in and out through the trees. Sometimes she would fall into trances, her body still while her mind drifted inside the flame. There she would see flashes. Women in robes with hands outstretched, fire circling them in protective spirals, jars glowing with the sorrow of 100 hearts. She knew then that she was not the first. And that she wouldn't be the last. Still there was danger. One afternoon she tried to pour more of herself into the ember, testing how far she could push. She brought up the worst memories, the locked doors, the harsh beatings, the silence she'd been forced to swallow. Her body convulsed as she relived them, and the ember flared uncontrollably. Flames burst from her hands, scorching the earth, igniting dry leaves nearby. She screamed, not from pain but from fear that she'd lose control. She dropped the stone and fell to her knees, gasping. It took her hours to calm the flame again. She sat, shivering in the charred clearing, learning that fire needed more than fuel. It needed direction, restraint, purpose. After that she returned to Elder Nana for guidance. The old woman listened in silence, her fingers tracing ancient symbols into the dirt. When the girl finished speaking, Nana only said, "Emotion is the key, but discipline is the lock. If you want to use this gift without being consumed, you must honor both." Nana taught her to breathe, to focus, to align her pulse with the embers. It wasn't like learning spells from a scroll, it was a surrender, a communion. They meditated together in the dark, sometimes surrounded by candles that she was told not to light with her hands, but with intention. She succeeded by the third night. In time the ember responded not just to grief but to resolve, to strength. She learned how to hold it above her head without flinching, to pass it from palm to palm without a thought. The fire had become an extension of her. Not a weapon but a truth. Still the full jar remained a mystery. It sat now beneath the floorboards of her stepmother's old room, in the place where her torment had begun. The girl had gone back, stepping into that house with trembling hands, her heart thudding in her chest. Dust coated every surface and cobwebs draped from the ceiling beams like forgotten veils. The silence inside was oppressive. It was like the house itself remembered. She found the jar wrapped in cloth, the markings along its rim pulsing faintly. Not in flame but in sound, a low humming vibration that shook her bones when she drew near. It was heavier than she expected and warm to the touch. Not burning. Not cold. Just waiting. For weeks she studied it. She brought it into the forest. She listened. And once, when she sat in full sorrow and pressed the ember against the jar's surface, she felt the faintest shift, like the jar had recognized its sibling. The two pulses aligned for a breathless second and then parted. Nana warned her, "You can't force it. The jar has taken more pain than one heart can hold. If you open it without preparation it won't be a release, it will be a flood. And fire drowns too when it loses shape." So the girl practiced more. She learned to separate her feelings, to name them. Anger was the sharp edge. Grief was the heavy stone. Hope the fragile thread. Each had a place. Each fed the flame in its own way. She didn't seek to suppress them anymore. She let them live, watched how the ember responded. It danced with sorrow. It grew still in peace. It pulsed with fury. She began to understand that the flame wasn't just reacting, it was reflecting. The ember was a mirror to her spirit. And so, she began to forge herself into someone stronger, not without pain but in full ownership of it. Her body grew steadier, her eyes clearer. She could feel the weight of the jar shift now whenever she approached. It sensed her change. It responded. The lid had begun to loosen ever so slightly, a whisper of ash escaping when she breathed near it. The release was close. But she knew the final step couldn't come through force or even technique. It had to come through choice. Through trust. The flame inside her would not burn her unless she lost faith in it, or in herself. So one twilight, as the orange sky melted into night, she returned to the clearing. She placed the jar on a flat stone and sat before it, the ember resting in her lap. She spoke aloud, not to Nana, not to her stepmother, but to the pain itself. "I am not afraid of you anymore," she said. "You shaped me. You caged me. But you also awakened me." She closed her eyes. She let her heart break open. Memories poured through her, the good and the terrible. Her mother's embrace. Her stepmother's backhand. The loneliness. The defiance. The wonder of seeing the ember for the first time. The laughter she'd almost forgotten she had once known. Her tears came freely now. Not stolen. Not trapped. Given. The ember flared. So did the jar. For the first time she saw light spill from its seams, not just fire but something golden, something almost soft. It poured from the mouth like a song unsung for centuries. The flames did not leap to hurt her. They rose gently, encircling her, and the jar slowly cracked open, not in explosion but in release. And from inside came not just heat, but voices, whispers of all the sorrow it had held, voices of girls and women long gone, their pain now lifting into the air, their burdens eased. The magic dissipated like mist at dawn. When it was over, the jar lay in pieces. But the ember remained, steady in her hands. She had not burned. She had become. The air was thick with tension the moment she stepped into the dim room where the jar had lived in secret so long. The shadows clung to the walls like dark fingers, twisting and stretching as the flickering candlelight barely touched the corners. Her stepmother stood by the wooden table, her eyes narrowing sharply when she noticed the girl enter, the ember glowing softly in her hands. "You shouldn't be here," the stepmother said, voice low and cold. "You don't understand what you're meddling with." The girl took a steady breath, holding the warmth of the ember close to her chest. "I understand enough," she said firmly. "You stole my tears, my pain. You trapped them in that jar. I want them back." The stepmother's lips twisted into a bitter smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "You think your tears are yours to take back? They belong to the fire now. To the power it gives me. Without it, this house and the village beyond would fall into ruin." The girl's heart hammered, but she refused to step back. "No. You used my sorrow for control. For dark magic that steals from others. That ends now." A sudden movement from the stepmother, and the jar was in her hands, glowing faintly like a heartbeat caught in clay. The girl felt the ember pulse fiercely, answering the jar's light. The room grew warmer, the flames from the candles flickering wildly as if responding to the tension. With a harsh laugh, the stepmother raised the jar high. "You want your tears? Come and take them." The jar exploded into flame, bright and furious, bathing the room in red and gold. The fire was alive, writhing and twisting like a living thing. It surged between them in roaring waves, smoke curling upward, filling the small space with the scent of burning earth and old magic. The girl didn't hesitate. She lifted the ember, holding it out as if to meet the fire head-on. The heat was overwhelming, blistering her skin, but the ember was steady, a calm heart amid the blaze. She focused inward, feeling the sadness she'd long tried to hide, grief, anger, loneliness, and let it flow into the flame. The fire shifted instantly, no longer wild and untethered, but bending to her will. It danced like a partner, fierce and elegant, responding to the rhythm of her sorrow and strength entwined. Her stepmother's eyes widened in disbelief, then narrowed in fury. "You think you can control the fire? You don't know its price." But the girl knew better now. The fire demanded truth and balance, not destruction. She reached deep inside, drawing every painful memory, every stolen tear, not to let them burn her, but to fuel her power with their honesty. The jar cracked, and the flames roared louder, the heat so intense it blistered the wooden floor beneath their feet. The fire flickered wildly, a storm of sparks swirling around them like a tempest. They were locked in a battle not of fists, but of wills and emotions, two forces fighting to claim the same power. The stepmother tried to push forward, her hands weaving strange, frantic gestures, summoning shadows and fire. The girl met her stepmother's will with her own calm fury, shaping the blaze with grace born of pain and resilience. For a moment, the fire threatened to consume them both, licking hungrily at skin and air. The girl's breath came fast, sweat running down her brow, but she held firm, refusing to let the flame become a weapon of destruction. She whispered to the ember, "I am not your prisoner. I am your master." The flame bowed to her words, its wildness folding into a steady blaze that warmed without burning. It wrapped around her like a cloak, fierce but protective, a manifestation of all she had endured and overcome. Her stepmother staggered back, fear flickering in her eyes for the first time. The girl stepped forward, closing the distance between them, her voice soft but resolute. "Your time is over. The pain you stole will be returned. The fire will no longer serve you alone." The stepmother's face twisted with rage, but she was weakened, the power of the jar fading as the girl's control grew stronger. With one last desperate cry, she lunged toward the ember, but the girl lifted her hands and the fire surged between them, a barrier of light and heat. The stepmother shrieked as the flames pressed against her, forcing her to retreat. The jar shattered on the floor, shards glowing faintly before turning to ash. The room grew still. The fire dimmed, retreating into the ember, which now burned with a calm, steady glow. The girl let out a long breath, the weight of what had passed settling deep inside her. She looked at her stepmother, who now trembled where she stood, no longer the powerful witch, but a woman stripped of her stolen magic. "I forgive you," the girl said quietly. "But this ends here." Her stepmother nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. For the first time she seemed to see the girl not as a victim but as an equal, someone who had claimed her own power through pain and courage. As the girl stepped outside into the cool night air, the ember's warmth pulsed gently in her palm. The fire had tested her, and she had won. Not by destroying but by embracing the flames within. The rebellion was over. And the fire, now her own, would light the way forward. For years the village had lived under a heavy silence. It was a silence that went beyond words, deeper than the hush of night or the stillness of the fields. The people had learned to swallow their pain, to hide their tears as if showing sorrow was a weakness that could unravel everything they had built. Generations passed with wounds kept beneath the surface, grief tucked away, sadness locked inside hearts that no longer dared to break. But everything changed when the girl returned. She came back not with a song nor with promises, but with a fire in her eyes and an ember glowing faintly in her hand. The villagers gathered around her, curious at first, whispers spreading like wind through the crowded market and down narrow lanes. They saw the ember's light, warm and steady, cutting through the dusk like a beacon. Her story was simple, yet it held a power that reached deep into their souls. She told them of the stolen tears, of the jar that trapped her sorrow, and how she had reclaimed her grief not by hiding it, but by embracing it. She spoke of the fire, wild and fierce, yes, but also of control, of transforming pain into strength rather than letting it consume her. At first many were skeptical. The old ways were deeply rooted in the village's heart. To speak of tears openly was almost taboo, a crack in the carefully constructed armor of silence. But something in her voice, in the glow of that ember, awakened something long buried in the people. A flicker of recognition, of hope. Slowly the silence began to break. Old women in worn cloaks touched their faces where tears once fell in secret. Young men lowered their heads, voices thick as they shared losses they had carried alone for too long. Mothers whispered stories of children lost, of love turned to sorrow, of dreams shattered. The village square became a place not of quiet endurance but of shared pain and healing. The girl walked among them, the ember lighting the way, a symbol of reclaimed emotion and raw truth. She urged the villagers not to fear their tears, not to hide the fire burning inside them. "Your sorrow is not weakness," she said. "It is a well of power waiting to be unlocked." Her words spread like wildfire. One by one, villagers began to confront the jars they had kept hidden, literal jars or invisible vessels of pain and silence. Some were clay pots filled with dried petals and ashes, others were memories held tight in trembling hands. With trembling courage they brought these jars into the light and broke them open. Each breaking was a small rebellion, a release of grief and fear. Tears flowed freely now, not as signs of defeat but as cleansing waters washing over old wounds. The air seemed to shift, lighter somehow, as if the village itself was breathing again. The fire from the girl's ember seemed to pulse in response, glowing brighter with every broken jar. It became a beacon for the village's new beginning, proof that sorrow, once reclaimed, could burn away the darkness and bring warmth and light. Elders who had long carried the weight of regret found voices to speak their truths. Children who had learned to hide their hurt began to cry without shame. Even the men who had hardened themselves against pain showed flickers of vulnerability as they shared stories of loss and hope. The village had awakened, not from sleep, but from a long nightmare of silent suffering. Communities gathered around nightly fires, sharing stories and tears beneath the stars. Songs arose, filled with sorrow and strength intertwined. The ember in the girl's hand became a communal flame, passed from one to another, each person feeding it with their own reclaimed tears and memories. The transformation was not immediate nor without struggle. Some resisted the change, clinging to silence out of fear or habit. There were moments when the weight of grief threatened to overwhelm, when the flames of sorrow burned too fiercely. But the girl stood firm, reminding everyone that the fire was not to be feared, it was to be understood and honored. Through this shared pain, the village began to heal. Old wounds slowly closed as the power of collective sorrow became a source of unity and strength rather than isolation and shame. The fire was no longer a symbol of control or destruction, but one of rebirth and courage. The girl's journey had become their journey, and the ember a spark that ignited hearts across the village. The jars that once held silent tears now lay broken on the ground, their shards glittering like fragments of a past left behind. In their place grew a new tradition, one of openness, compassion, and the freedom to feel deeply and openly. The village no longer feared the storm of emotions but embraced the rain as a necessary part of life's cycle. The fire within each person glowed brighter with every shared story, every tear shed without shame. And as the village thrived in this new light, the girl knew that the true power of the stolen tears was not in the jar, but in the courage to reclaim them and let them burn with fierce honesty. The village had awakened, and with it, a legacy of strength born from the deepest sorrow. The morning light filtered softly through the small window of the quiet room where the girl sat, her thoughts tangled in a storm of emotions. After everything, the stolen tears, the fire, the village awakening, there was one truth she still could not grasp fully. It was the truth of the woman she had battled and yet could not hate completely, her stepmother. The stepmother's harshness had been a shadow over her childhood, a cage made of cold words and unyielding discipline. But now, after their battle of fire and will, after the jar had been shattered and the magic unraveled, a new story was beginning to surface. One whispered in cracks and sighs, in glances filled with regret rather than rage. The girl found herself drawn back to the old house, to the place where the ember still glowed faintly in her palm, a reminder of what had passed. The stepmother sat across from her, not with the stern face of a tormentor, but with eyes softened by years of sorrow. She looked older somehow, her shoulders slumped beneath the weight of secrets long kept. "I want you to understand," the stepmother began, her voice trembling as if every word was a painful confession. "There was a time before all this, before the tears were stolen, before the jar. A time when I was like you, vulnerable, afraid, and broken." The girl listened, heart pounding, as the stepmother unfolded a story that had remained buried beneath layers of anger and fear. Years ago, before she became the woman who ruled their home with a cold hand, the stepmother had been a young woman with a family of her own. A husband and 2 children, their lives simple and filled with laughter. But one terrible night, a fire tore through their village. Flames consumed their home and everything they loved. The stepmother's family perished in the blaze, leaving her alone in a world of ash and silence. She spoke of the night in painful detail, how the fire had spread with terrible speed, how she had tried to save them but had been trapped outside, powerless. The screams, the smoke, the helplessness, all burned into her memory like scars on her soul. After that night, the stepmother said, she had vowed never to feel that helplessness again. She bottled her emotions, locking them away as tightly as the jar she later kept hidden in their home. The cruelty she had shown was born from a desperate need to protect herself from pain so unbearable it threatened to consume her entirely. "It was not hatred that made me steal your tears," she said quietly, "but fear. Fear of losing what little control I had left. I thought if I could contain pain, if I could turn it into power, I could keep myself safe. I never wanted to hurt you, but I was lost in my own darkness." The girl's breath caught in her throat. For so long she had seen only the harshness and cruelty, the coldness that had crushed her spirit. But now she saw the fracture beneath the surface, the broken woman shaped by grief and terror. Tears welled in her eyes, not the stolen tears, but the ones that had been held back by anger and pain. The stepmother reached out, her hand trembling as it brushed against the girl's. It was a fragile gesture, but one filled with the weight of years of regret. The girl looked at her, the ember glowing softly between them, a symbol of their shared pain and hope. The choice before her was clear, yet heavy: to destroy the woman who had caused her so much suffering, or to forgive and perhaps find a way to heal both their broken hearts. Forgiveness was not easy. It was a path fraught with uncertainty and vulnerability. To forgive was to acknowledge the depth of the stepmother's pain, to see her not as a villain but as a wounded soul who had acted out of fear. It meant releasing the grip of hatred and choosing compassion instead. The girl closed her eyes, feeling the ember's warmth spread through her fingers and into her heart. She thought of all she had endured, the stolen tears, the fire, the awakening of her village. She thought of the power in embracing sorrow rather than running from it. And she realized that forgiveness was part of that power.